My name is Jeremy Thake. I'm a Principal PM on the Microsoft Graph team, and today I have the pleasure of personally presenting on some stuff we've been working on in the last few weeks. And also Daryl Miller, who is in Amsterdam, will be presenting on some of the Microsoft Graph SDK work we've been doing. Just a quick reminder, these calls are monthly. They happen on the first Tuesday of every month at 8 a.m. Pacific time. You can use the aka.ms Microsoft Graph call link to download the ICS calendar and add it to your own personal calendar to remind you for next month. Our next call actually won't be in May. It will be in June, primarily because Build is the first week of May next month, and we'll have lots of coverage of Microsoft Graph in the keynotes, and also we'll have a handful, like I think 6 or 7 sessions on Microsoft Graph that will be streaming live as well. So keep your eyes open for details on that in a blog post that we'll share, so you'll know how you can access those online. And if you're coming in person, please make sure you come say hi to us at our booth in the expo hall that we're busily planning at the moment. So it'd be nice to meet a few familiar Microsoft Graph faces there in person. So no call next month. Our next call will be June 4th. So as I mentioned today, we're actually going to have 2 kind of sections of this call. The first one is going to be for Daryl, who's going to be showcasing some of the new Microsoft Graph SDK features, and then I'm going to go through and talk about Microsoft Postman Collections. But before we do that, if I can just remind everyone just to mute their microphones. I can hear a few people breathing, and I'm pretty sure that's not Daryl getting ready. I just wanted to remind you about the Graph website and some changes we've made to try and make your experience a little bit better as a Microsoft developer. The homepage of graph.microsoft.com, which resolves to developer.microsoft.com/graph, we heard loud and clear that you found that the blogs weren't as easy to find. So I've reduced the resolution for screen share purposes today, but typical laptops now have the blogs above the fold in a browser window. And so now you can see all the news that we're updating on the SDKs. And again, you can go view more in here to see a lot more blog posts that are coming through. And also, just so you know, you can get to it in here, but it is a little bit buried, and so that's why we've put it on the homepage in that swim lane. The blog does have an RSS feed as well. So if people are trying to keep up with the blog and don't want to keep revisiting it or relying on tweets from the Office Dev handle or my handle or Yina's handle and others that retweet news, if you scroll to the bottom of the page, not only can you follow the Office Dev handle here, but you can also grab the RSS feed. So if you use that in any of your feedly.coms, is the one that I use personally, but there's lots of different RSS readers out there. That'll allow you to keep up to date with the blog posts as they immediately get published. So that was just a few little kind of tidbit helpers there. And then in addition to that, we have tried to change the pivot on how you get started with the graph a little bit. And so we have this get started experience that we've had for a few months now, where I have the ability to go in, for instance, on ASP.NET. And not only can I get started by jumping into a quick start experience. If you could mute your mic, please. I will start calling out names for people who don't do that when they come in. It makes me jump as a very minimal thing. The quick start allows you to get started in 3 minutes. So in this example, if I went through this, it would download a zip file that I could run in Visual Studio, and it would pre-bake the client ID and secret into the project. So you could essentially just F5 that and have your first app up and running within a few moments. But also what you can do is you can actually go through and create your first project by following this tutorial.
You're not sharing at the moment, Jeremy, just so you know.
Has it dropped the sharing?
Yeah, it did, yeah.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. Can you re-see that now?
Yeah, that's back now, thank you.
Thank you, thanks for letting me know. And so this allows you to walk through step by step all the way from file new project in Visual Studio, for instance, with this one with ASP.NET, all the way through to actually making the calls using the SDK to get me events and returning that to the screen. And so this is a great way of just, if you haven't done this yet, exploring the Microsoft Graph in that way. And then one last thing I wanted to show was that in the top here in the docs, we've now got a new landing page where we decided to make the main areas of our documentation a little bit more prominent, so they're not only discoverable in the TOCs here on the left-hand side. And so you can get to all the tutorials and the quick starts for every platform here, as well as jump into the SDKs that we have available. And then you can get to the changelog, which is essentially where every time a change goes out on the V1 or the beta service, we go through and we update these. So in March, you can see that we introduced some risky user API changes in the beta and some changes to the directory APIs. And we insist that the engineers and PMs actually put in information and in cases link directly to the documents for those changes, so that you can see those things that are happening inside of the documentation. So we're hoping this new landing page, which essentially you get to by clicking on docs and the top navigation for many of the Microsoft Graph experiences, will be super useful to kind of get you started and also get you to the common areas. And so we're going to be doing a few more improvements across the Learn section in the next few months, but that was just based on all your feedback. We've made additional improvements there. So I just want to say a big thank you for everyone for continuing to provide that feedback. And also just like contacting us, letting us know what things are working for them and what they'd like to see improved. And so with that, the first one that I wanted to have Daryl talk to is the SDKs that we've been working on at Microsoft. So Daryl, thank you for joining the community call from Europe. I'm not even sure I can do the time translation on what time of day it is there for you.
Oh, it's just 5 o'clock in the evening. So
there you go.
Almost the end of the day.
Almost finished your day, but now you're ready to wow the audience with Microsoft SDK information.
I will do my best.
Well, look, I'll let you take over sharing the screen, and
Okay.
I will put myself on mute. So thanks, Daryl.
Okay, let me start the slideshow from current slide. Okay, so just to set expectations for those of you who were able to join me in the SDK talk at MVP Summit, the demos that I'm showing are basically the same demos. So feel free to either go get yourself a coffee or during these demos, or you can critique me and tell me whether I did a better or worse job on this. What I'm going to talk to you today about are two main things. One is the authentication providers and the Graph Client Factory, which is going to be upcoming. Now, just to be absolutely clear, these authentication providers are really just adapters to the MSAL libraries that we provide, that the identity team provide. And we are just taking opportunity to make the experience that little bit easier because of the specialization with regards to working with Graph and the way the SDK works. So we have these auth providers, which are completely optional for using the SDK in various repos on GitHub. So we have a .NET auth providers, Java, Android, and Objective-C. And generally the way each of these work is we have an auth provider for each of the main authentication flows, auth to authentication flows. But let me go and share some code, and we'll actually see how these things work. So I'm going to pull up the very first example, which we're going to start from a really simplistic console app type scenario. I have already pulled in the NuGet packages. You can see if you go to our GitHub repos, they tell you all the dependencies that you need to pull in. It's basically just one extra NuGet package. And let's start by where we normally start when working with the Graph SDK. We go and we create a Graph service client. So we're going to new up a Graph service client like this. And you'll see we get a red squiggly because it's actually asking for us another parameter, but we're going to leave that for the moment and we'll keep going. So what we want to do, this is a nice simple case, we'll go and get the canonical user equals graph service client dot me dot request dot get async, and then of course because it's async we're going to put an await at the beginning of here, and then when we get it back, just to prove that it actually worked, we're going to do a little right out to the console and pull out some property from user.displayName, for example. Okay. So in order to make this work, let me close down a few things here so you can see. We need to solve this red squiggly. So what does it expect from us? Well, it expects something that implements iAuthentication provider. Now, in the past, we have provided a single authentication provider, which we call the delegate authentication provider. The problem with the delegate authentication provider is it really doesn't do a lot of work for you. It pretty much expects you to provide it with a function that will come back and get the authorization token or the bearer token. So it basically making you do all of the work. So in order to make life easier, we've created a set of authentication providers, and I'm going to pick one using the interaction authentication flow. Yeah, the interaction flow, which is the one that's actually going to come and pop up a UI and allow me to enter my username and password. So let's create the interaction authentication provider. And okay, well, so it needs some parameters. It needs a public client application and it needs scopes. So, well, where do I get the public client application? Well, this is where it brings us back to the way we're used to doing it with MSAL. MSAL allows you to create either a public client application or a confidential client application, depending on the flow that you're using. In the case of interactive authentication provider, we need a public client application. Public, I'll just call it app. Save me typing a little bit. Yeah, okay. I did it a little differently and threw myself off. Okay, so new. Now we could just do new public client application here and use the constructors as is, or we've also created some static helper methods or factory methods on the flow. So you can do interactive authentication provider, create client application, and it will ask you for just the pieces of information that are needed for this particular flow. So once you have that app, and it's going to ask me for client ID, which I'll go and fill in a moment. And then here we just provide that app into the authentication provider. And we're going to need to give it some scopes because we're going to go and read the user. So that's just a string array of user.read. The quotes, I don't have too many or too few semicolons. What I actually did originally was I took that out and put it on a previous line so that I don't do quite so much scrolling. Auth provider. Let's go. And suddenly my keyboard stops working. There we go. Our auth provider. What was in my clipboard was not what I expected. Okay. Let me try that again. Undo. There we go. Copy that. Our auth provider. There we go. Now we have. So we've created an app, but we're going to need a client ID. I've already preset up a client ID. I don't happen to remember the GUID, so let me go and copy that from my notes over here. Okay. We've created ourselves a public client application. We've created ourselves an auth provider for the flow that we want to use. We pass that auth provider into the graph service client, and then we're going to go and make a REST request. And this is where I like to hold my breath, say a little auth prayer, and we run that, and hopefully we will see a username. Oh, actually, no, of course, we're going to see a login pop-up because it's an interactive flow. It's going to ask me to sign in, and it's going to ask me to consent. First time I've done this. Well, first time I've done this since deleting the application instance from AD. Okay, apparently I didn't click hard enough. There we go. And we get welcome to requesting permissions that are either invalid or out of date. Did I do that famous users.read instead of user.read? I gotta check, is it users or user? It's user.read, I did it correctly. Okay, well, if at first it doesn't succeed, let's try it again. There we go. We worked this time. There's probably a little bit of provisioning time there, a little too quick between that authentication and making that first call, I suspect. Okay, so we have that information. We've been able to make the request, and it magically went and got the token under the covers. And now, because we're using the MSAL library, it will automatically take care of if that token expires, it will go and use the refresh token in order to update that token. So all of that hard work is taken care of us by the MSAL library. Now, next example here, let's do something else. Let's go get messages. And just to save you from having to watch me type, I'm just going to go and copy this little chunk of code here. Now, I'm going to get just this part, because otherwise I'll give away the magic. Okay. So I named the service client differently. Service client. Get async. Now, in this particular case, if I attempt to run this, it's going to fail. And it's going to tell me you can't make this call because you haven't granted this application consent to access the messages that belong to you. So that's not going to work. So what we really need to do is also grant the consent. So we've got a couple of options here. We could go back up to the authorization provider and change what we initialize that application, those default set of permissions, or because that's not recommended, it's not the recommended practice that when you first install an app, you ask for every single permission that might ever be needed in the application. What is the recommended approach is to do incremental consent. So the question is, how do we do incremental consent? Well, I've just created myself a little right line here so that we can actually see that this works. What I do is, whilst making the request, I say with, I could actually type, it would be better. There we go. Okay, new string. What happens? You're a PM for a few months and you lose all your dev typing skills. There we go. Mail.read. Okay. Now, just before I go on and show you that, just note when you do with, there are a number of other options here. Because of different flows and different scenarios, we also allow you to do things like with user account, with user assertion for the on behalf of flow, with username password. So there's a variety of other different ways of configuring the various pieces of infrastructure that we have under the cover on a per request basis. And so we've started adding these extension methods to allow us to configure the underlying middleware pipeline that provides these behaviors that we've embedded into the SDK. So we're now going to do incremental consent. We already consented to the first user.read, but now when we run this, hopefully when we run this, it's going to pop up another dialog. It's going to require me to sign in again because it's going to ask for consent. Oh, actually, that was the first sign in was just because it needed to get the first token. Now it's asking me to sign in again because it realizes it needs additional consent. So now it's actually asking me that, okay, I need to read, will you allow this application to read the mail? We can click accept. I only had to click once, and there we go. We have the number of messages that are in the first page of the responses that came back.
Daryl, forgive my interruption. Can you explain, when you registered the app, did you request mail.read at that time as well during the app registration?
No, I did not. These can be added dynamically. The scopes that you register at configuration time, and I'm luckily there's a number of other identity folks on the wire. So if I say something wrong here, be sure to correct me. But if you want to use the scopes that are configured in the app, then up here you can specify the HTTPS graph.microsoft.com .default. Okay, and then this application will request the scopes that are configured in the app registration. So there are two distinct ways of saying what permissions an application needs. But with incremental consent, you don't need to have preset those up in the portal. And I will pause momentarily, just in case anybody wants to add any qualifications to those statements. Hearing silence. Oh,
yeah, there's a chat going on, so you answered the chat question there. I kind of set you up, so thank you.
Excellent, thank you.
I have a question here.
Yes.
So as you can see here, you are saying you can increment the scopes you're trying to add. So what is the use of the scopes that we are adding for when you register an application on the portal this way? I think it's meaningless to use the default scopes for the application, since we can already change it in runtime.
I'm going to defer to somebody else to decide when is the right time to use the scopes in the application registration versus scopes in the setting them up as part of the you're actually embedding them into your actual application. I'm not aware of what are the pros and cons, and hopefully if we have some documentation that clarifies that, I will definitely provide some links to it. But I don't know whether there are any distinct advantages with regards to initialization. Obviously, with dynamic scopes, you need to do that at the point in your application where you are actually going to use those scopes.
I can chime in a little bit here from the perspective of the experience I had when I was outside of Microsoft as a software vendor. There are many scenarios where you might have a base set of permissions that allows your customers to trial you with a set of permissions to get basic functionality of your application, your SaaS application. And then you might have advanced features or premium features that require more consent, maybe write or read write alls or access to other parts of Microsoft 365 and beyond that you do as an incremental consent later on once that customer has purchased your premium version of your product that requires more consent. This gives you a way of having kind of a baseline set of permissions that maybe customers are more comfortable with using you for from a trial perspective, that is maybe just read type permissions to various different scopes. And then once they've unlocked that, you could provide a flow through your application that then requests this incremental consent to a variety of other resources that would require more stringent things like admin consent maybe, and various other things in here too. And so that's just one scenario. There are quite a few more. I'll dig the documentation and put it in the messaging chat that'll go through kind of the pros and cons of those approaches. But that's certainly one that I've seen from incremental consent that is super valuable to an ISV that's building something.
And if I can take half a minute from an enterprise dev perspective, I've seen teams where they'll want to control the permissions, and so they tell developers and do code reviews on developers to say .default, and then the tenant administrator can then control what scopes are requested in registration to kind of limit developers from doing things they shouldn't be doing. So it really all depends on your scenario and the permissions of the people running it.
Well, I appreciate that little segue. It allowed me to deal with the hotel staff that decided to come clean my room during a session. Okay, so the one thing that you may have noticed last time we ran this, it kept asking me for a token. And it kept asking me to sign in again and again. And from a development time perspective, that can be a little bit of a pain. So that allows me to introduce another feature, which is an important feature in that there is an underlying token cache that MSAL implements, but it isn't a persistent cache. And if in a production application, you'll need a persistent cache, and there's a variety of different options. But it's also handy to have one purely at development time, and this is what I had created just for demo purposes. And there's a strong warning: do not use this in a production sample. So this is just simply a file-based token storage provider, and I'll just show you the code that goes underneath here. It simply, there's an interface where you get a set of bytes and you write a set of bytes, and there's a cache ID, and I'm literally just storing it in a file in a local disk. There is ongoing work, and there's a number of different samples for real token providers that will store to, say, Redis or various other file storages. This is purely for a development time, but it's a nice convenience. It allows you to implement that and then pass that into this factory method. So now I'm going to run this for the first time, and it actually didn't ask me to sign in because from demos that I've run previously, I already had a token previously. Now, obviously, that token's expired, but it also has a refresh token. So it was able to go off and refresh that old token from a demo that I did probably 2 weeks ago now, and go and request a new token, and it avoids all of the sign-in stuff. So from a development time perspective, that makes life a little bit easier, but it's also a hook to plug in a more complete production level persistent token storage, or not just for persistence, but also in the case of a web farm scenario where you want to use a centralized token storage so that when you don't have server affinity, you're not constantly asking somebody for a new token when they happen to hit a different web server. So this is the main set of capabilities that we have built around these authorization providers. And as we say, we set up a number of different flows, but this makes the assumption that you're using our SDK as is in order to be able to take advantage of this authorization provider, because that's where you pass it into our Graph Service Client. Now, there's, I'm sure, a significant number of people, even on the call, who are doing apps and currently aren't using our SDKs. So we want to be, one of the things that we've been working heavily on is trying to provide capabilities, whether or not you want that rich, strongly typed IntelliSense request builder model type mechanism, or whether you just want to use a native HTTP client library. So I'm just going to switch over to another sample. Now, in this case, it's actually a .NET Core console app, because we work both in full framework or .NET Core. And this time we're going to take a slightly different approach. I'm going to just go and create a new client, which is a new HTTP client. Right now, I want to be able to make a call, and obviously I can make a call to the Microsoft Graph just simply using get async and then passing it whack me to be able to go and get a response like this. Okay, but this is obviously going to fail because it doesn't have any authorization token. Now, it would be really nice if we could reuse that auth provider infrastructure that we have within an HTTP client. And we can actually do that because the way that our service library layer implements this capability is using a built-in capability of HTTP client called message handlers. And if you actually look at the constructor of HTTP client, you can pass in a pipeline of message handlers. The only problem is the way that you have to set up these message handlers is you can have to chain them together, and then manipulating those handlers is a bit of a pain. So what we've done is we've built a Graph client factory. Now, just as a word of warning, in the version 1.14 that we recently published, this class is still internal. We expect within the next week or so to be creating a preview of 1.15 in .NET that makes this library public. And although I am talking about .NET here, these same concepts apply across all of our languages, and you should be able to do the same capability across all the languages. So if you now do .create here, you can, somebody has their mic open. If you can, they probably can't hear me, but hopefully they will mute it. You can do create, it will create that client. Now, ideally, we would set up the auth handler here automatically, and that's one of the early feedbacks that we've got is we should set up the auth handler automatically for you, but we actually don't. So you actually have to customize the middleware pipeline in order to inject that in. So again, just to avoid you having to watch me type too much, I'm going to go grab this little chunk of code here. And we'll walk through what's going on here. So in the Graph Client Factory, not only do we let you create a client with a set of default handlers pre-built in, we also allow you to go and say, well, okay, tell me what handlers you would put in there by default so that then I can manipulate that list of handlers. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm getting the list of handlers that are going to be inserted into the HTTP client. And I'm going to insert a new one called an authentication handler. Now, this authentication handler expects as a parameter, if I can hover over the right part here, let's just redo this, an authentication provider. So in the same way that we pass an authentication provider into the Graph service client with our whole service model, that's the large, fairly heavy DLL, we can also do this with our lightweight core DLL. And the only thing now is to provide it with an auth provider. Now, I could go off and do the same interaction auth provider. However, unfortunately, at this point in time, that won't work in .NET Core. I believe in a later version of MSAL, it is going to work in .NET Core too. There's a little challenge with popping up UI in .NET Core console apps. So what we do instead is we use this other flow, which is called device code provider. So it's the same story, right? Device code provider, create a client application, creates as an app. We then create a device code provider instance. We pass the app in with our token that we're interested in. And I think if I just, oh yeah, here, let's just throw this in straight away. New file-based token provider. We can use exactly the same token provider mechanism with this device code flow. And actually, let's not do that because then we won't actually get to see the experience. Okay, so we've created our application, which is the same as a regular old MSAL public client application. We've created this provider. We've passed it into the authentication handler, which we inserted into our list of handlers. And now when we go and create the HTTP instance, we pass it in the list of handlers. And if I hover over this var, you can see that this is just a standard HTTP client instance. Now, I think I might have forgotten something. Yeah, let's just, yeah, I wanted to do this response instead. And if you notice on creating of the HTTP client, there are some other properties that you can set here. You can say which version you want. So I'm going to pick just the v1.0. We can also do this with the beta endpoint. There is a little bug at the moment that requires you to put that slash in there, but that slash is going to go away when we come in our preview. And you can also select a national cloud. So if you were writing an app against Black Forest or against the China or Germany cloud, you can specify that just using an enum. By default, it will hit the public instance. And I believe that's correct if I've got that. Okay, let me just this one, and then we'll write it out just to make sure that we're actually getting something back. Console.read, write line. User response. Apparently, I don't want to put that in. There we go. Okay. So let's try this. Tension mounts. Aha. Well, that's an interesting one. If we go back to the browser here, we'll see that it's saying to sign in, use a web browser to open the page, device login, and enter this particular code. This is the standard auto flow. But it looks like it ran right past this, which I'm going to guess means I forgot to put an await in somewhere. So let's just, because I've never seen this source link will download from the internet error before. Well, not at least while doing this demo. So no, I did an await there. That's a curious one. Maybe that's an interesting thing about doing things on a hotel Wi-Fi. Let's try it again and see whether or not it still gives me a hard time. If not, I'm just going to put a breakpoint. Okay, well, let's do disable. Pending and use, oh yeah, well, that's because I've run it a second time. Okay, let's go to the browser. Device. I got to go look what message it told me. It said sign in, go to Microsoft.com device login. Microsoft.com/device login. And let's go grab this code. Next. Let's see if we can recover from this mysterious. Okay, it's asking me to sign in. Okay, we've signed into .NET Console application. Looks like it's struggling to get some CSS there. Let's pause there. It's probably still hung up over here. Let's see what happens if we do continue here. It's really not happy with me. Okay, well, because I ran it twice, let's see whether or not if we do this again, what will happen. Let's just start again from the beginning. Let's see what happens. One more time. Huh.
Tell you what, Daryl, do you want to troubleshoot this and let me do my demos, and we'll flip back to you and you magically would have fixed it with Hotel Juju?
Yeah, absolutely. We can do that.
There we go. Right.
Yeah, sure.
I'll just share my screen. There was one question while I'm flicking over, which was how are you, can this work with Xamarin because it's .NET standard? If I'm using it for Xamarin projects.
That would be our hope that it would work with Xamarin. It's .NET 1.3. So whatever Xamarin frameworks are compatible with 1.3, .NET Standard 1.3, you'll need to do, again, device code flow at the moment to make that happen, but I see no reason why not.
Cool. And then there was one way back at the top, which was from Bill Ayres, around questioning that there was no JavaScript listed on your slide.
Oh, that was a mistake on my behalf. There definitely is an authorization provided for JavaScript. Okay. It only does the implicit flow, though. There's only one flow in JavaScript.
Awesome. Well, I'm hoping everyone can see my screen. Bill says few. I'm hoping people can see my screen.
Well, I can. So
you can? You can't?
I can. Yes.
Okay.
You're all good. Go.
So again, going back to the blog, we announced this on Friday. Just for a little bit of background, at Microsoft, we have something called an FHL, a Fix, Hack, Learn Week, where we are essentially meant to remove everything from our calendar and do something to either fix, hack, or learn. And at the MVP Summit the week before, we had a significant amount of feedback from people that use Graph Explorer. So they go into our API playground here that Daryl is the PM on, and they run and see their responses. And you can see we have lots of different samples here from a variety of the different services that you can go pick and choose from. And you can either do it against our demo tenant that we have hosted. That's, Megan is our persona per choice. But you can also sign in with your own tenants as well. But we had feedback from the MVPs that were in the room that they actually use Postman for a variety of different scenarios, and that they would find it useful if we released a set of collections. So in my FHL last week, as well as getting everything ready for build, for you to enjoy in a few weeks, I decided to have a crack at this. And I've used Postman a lot in the past for a variety of different things. And so essentially this blog post just explains, what procedure we're using here. And I have a full length video of explaining how you can get this set up in your own environment, and a link at the bottom here to the repo and directly to the YouTube video. The repo lives inside of the Microsoft Graph organization on GitHub. Thank you for those that are starring it. Feel free to go crazy and others star it today so we can get those up. And thank you for forking it. I'm assuming there's contributions coming. And so essentially what I did was I took all of the Microsoft Graph Explorer samples and put them into Postman. So there's a lot of copying and pasting and a lot of clicking on the screen to get that to work. And then essentially the easiest way to get this in is if I go and grab these URLs. Now I spoke to the people at Postman, and if I wanted to, I could share the collection I've already kind of created and working on. But fundamentally, the reason to do an import rather than sharing is because then if you make changes, any changes I make to the collection, if I shared it, would be overwritten. Now, my take on this right now, based on feedback from people, is that by doing this with an import like this, and you'll see that we'll be able to import a copy, is I'm going to get my 121 requests, because that's what I've got in my repo right now. This is my working set that I'm adding some improvements to. And if you wanted to customize this, what I would recommend doing is creating your own collection, Jeremy's collection, and basically copying, duplicating, doing whatever you want and moving them into your own one and working on those. And then if you're ready, you can actually contribute back to the repo by forking the repo and submitting your change to the your copy of it by doing an export here and submitting that back as a PR. In terms of getting this running, essentially, this won't work on its own without environment variables, which I actually already have set up in my machine. If you're not familiar with these, you can have as many of these as you like. And what it allows me to do, if I go into view here, and you can see I've got a demo environment there where I've hidden the important parts in terms of the secret and the password, a la some of the people that love to go into tenants and nuke them as I'm doing demos. Thank you. And you'll see here that I'm putting in all the settings that I get from within inside of my application I've registered inside of my tenant. So much like what Daryl just showed with the client IDs and the secrets and the tenant IDs, we have to have these configured in here, enabled for this to work. If you try and run this without setting those things up, you will get an error. So the first thing you need to do is expand the on behalf of a user, and you want to go and get the user's access token. under the covers, what that's actually doing is it's configuring the request body to this particular URL, and we're using the environment variables here to build the URL and build the request. So you can see the client IDs and the secrets are coming through. And if I was to run this one, it would actually fail. And I'm actually going to take advantage of mute all just very quickly while I am there, because it won't mute me then. There you go. Is that it will tell me that the secret is invalid because I've actually selected my demo environment here. And so if I go over to my real environment and now click run, that will actually inject the right passwords and client secrets in here. And you'll see here that I now get back a set of permissions and an access token that I can now use to run other requests in this collection. So if I went over to get my profile, which would be the get that goes to the v1 me endpoint, you'll notice if you're familiar with Postman, there is an authorization tab here, and I'm telling it that there's a bearer token and I want it to use the user access token. So in my environment variables, if I just switch back here, you'll see that there's a user access token that gets, in my real one, it gets populated, much like my app access token would get populated too when I run this first command. And the way that it does that is in the tests tab. As long as all of my environment variables are filled out, it will actually go and store in the environment variable what it got back from this access token. So in my real environment, which I won't show you because it has all my passwords, this token will be stored. And then when I run my whack me request, essentially when I click send, it will return me all that information for what whack me is doing, because it got the token from the store in my environment variables there. And then you'll notice that in the tests, if it throws the invalid authentication token is, I will prompt you in the console. Now the console does not open at first, so you have to go into view here, and you'll see that as I'm running these things, in the past I've tried to run things that I get some errors. So I've actually gone through and added exactly what the lowest permission level is required for you to go and add permissions. So as an example of that, if I went into files here and did get drive files and click send, oh, that one worked. Let's do teams. Me join teams. You'll notice that this has come back with a 403. But if I went to the console and scroll down, it'll actually tell me that I need group read write all, which I know we get feedback that the permissions can be a little bit confusing, but if you look into the APIs and you look into teamwork and you look into teams and you go into kind of things like get teams, we actually do state that these are the ones that you need as a bare minimum at the top of every API documentation page. So to make that work in Postman, if I went over into the portal and I had a look at my permissions page, I can go into API permissions and click add permissions. I go into Microsoft Graph and I'm doing it on behalf of a user, so it's delegated permissions. And then if I do a search and click check on that, I can add that permission. Now, because I'm not using an interactive authentication flow, which I'll explain in a moment, I'm actually going to do that as a granting an admin consent here, and that will push that consent permission to all of my users without having my user be prompted. This is only for demo purposes. I am in a throwaway tenant. I'm using God mode in quotes because I'm an admin, not to be on test environments and production environments. Now, if I run this again, that's still not going to work. And the reason that's not going to work is the access token that I got that's in my environment variable didn't include that scope. So if I go through and rerun this now, you'll notice now that I now have in my scopes for this token the group read all. So now if I run my join teams, if my token is refreshing, and now I'm going to have to check where it is. So I'm going to just move myself off screen quickly. Okay, I'm going to just update that token manually. It should be doing it. I'm not going to troubleshoot it right now.
If you
I'm
want
not
to
gonna
pass the
troubleshoot.
baton back, I fixed my problem.
Yeah, right. But what that should do, and I'm not going to troubleshoot that right now, exactly why that's not using that token and getting me that 403. But with group read all, that should allow me to return my teams. And so whenever you change the permissions in the portal, you will need to rerun this particular get thing so that it updates this access token, and then in your environment variables, it updates these ones here. And then, so you can see here that we have a variety of different folders for the different aspects of the graph. And so even things like batch samples, we have a sample here that allows you to see that we're making a variety of requests in the order where they're just gets, and that will return those in a batch format. So you can have a great idea of just experimenting in the REST calls to understand all the different things you can do, even across things that we have in beta for things like getting applications. And there are cases where we have environment variables that aren't defined. And actually, there's a user voice request out with Postman right now that if this isn't defined and you try and run this, we'll actually prompt the user when they click send to ask for it. In this instance, what you would have to do is go down here and create a new application variable called application ID and give it whatever you wanted to do. Or you could just overwrite this URL and put whatever you want in. The benefit of doing it in an environment variable is if we ever improve these request examples, you'll actually be able to see those things coming through. And one other real nice thing we've done is that, making sure I'm on the right one, is that when I run things like get messages, in the results that get returned, it's returning the ID of the message. In our post test, what I'm actually doing is I'm going through and I'm grabbing the first message ID it finds in the response collection, which means that if I go down to get a user's individual message, I've already pre-populated the message ID, which means I can immediately test that without copying and pasting from my responses. So I'm able to chain a bunch of demos of my requests to see that this one just returns that individual message. In this case, it's returning the body of the email. So there's some nice little things that we can do in Postman with the benefit of all these post-test messages to get this stuff working. So it's very easy to get started, and the console will kind of help you along the way to make sure you know what's going on there. And I will let Daryl hand back because it sounds like he's confident he's managed to fix this.
Absolutely. Yes, it was a case of Visual Studio being a little aggressive at catching exceptions, and exceptions being used as control flow. So with a little change to the exception settings here in Visual Studio, now when I run this request, we are going to get our prompt as we got before, which is asking me to go to this page here. I'm going to go to this page, and it's asking me for the code. I'm going to grab the code. I'm going to grab the code without the space before and after. Paste that code in. Now it's going to ask me to sign in. And if I go back to my console app, momentarily, it's going to show the result, that basically the JSON response that came back. Now, because I'm using the core service library and not all of the generated models and everything, we just get it back as a chunk of JSON. Now, the more interesting part of this whole story, once you've started to reveal the way things work under the covers, is you can start to do all kinds of helpful things with this set of handlers. For example, I could add a new handler, and I created this just very simple demo logging handler. Our plan is to build a more production-ready logging handler, but this, you'll see what this does if I run this. And actually, it's just so that we don't have to keep doing the sign-in dance. Let's put that new file-based token provider there. And let's run that. Once again, it should, if all goes well, go find that token from a file, refresh it, and there we go. So now it's actually writing out, this is the request that was sent. This is my logging handler that sits in that pipeline so it can deal with both the request and the response. And the response comes back, and then we print the final response out. And because message handlers are able to maintain state before and after request, we can do things like start a stopwatch and return like this is how long this round trip took. And just as a last little teaser, another piece of functionality that we are looking to add, and I'm not going to put that at the end, I'm going to insert that. The order of where these handlers go is quite important, and you will get different behavior depending on where these go. I'm going to insert a compression handler, and what this is going to do is it's going to set an accept encoding header to say we know how to gzip, decompress things, so that when we send the request, Graph will know that we can actually decompress things, so it will return us back a compressed result. So this time it says content encoding gzip, and we get a compressed result, and well, our round trip time was even a little faster. And then the compression handler automatically decodes this. And the compression handler, as it's written, will actually compress uploaded content if it's over a certain size also. And the plan is to build that kind of capability directly into all of our language SDKs. So that's just a little teaser as to what is coming fairly soon. The authorization providers are all ready for folks to start playing around with and to give us feedback on. Just to call out the question that was asked earlier with regards to why there is no JavaScript library here, it's because the JavaScript auth provider is actually baked into the main package, so it's not in a separate repo. And you could go take a look at our Graph Client Factory class and how that works, and hopefully within a week or two that will be in a preview state so that you can actually start trying it out. And with that, I will hand it back to Jeremy.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Daryl. We let me just share my screen again. So just a little bit of an update. I hope you can see this. Myself and Paul, who actually asked some questions during the course, so thanks, Paul. We run a developer podcast specifically around M365. We've had some really good external guests on that Paul's been running around interviewing. So if you haven't checked out those particular episodes, please go check that out on m365devpodcast.com. Don't worry, it's audio. You don't have to see our weird bubble heads in any kind of video form there. And then just as a quick reminder, there are a bunch of videos on YouTube, on Office Dev YouTube. This is where these recordings will be. The next monthly call will not be next month. It'll be June 4th, primarily because of build. And just to give you one quick last update on this, one thing that I'm working on right now, based on some feedback that we got, if I just flick back here, in the issues aspect was where I'm using username and password, and I think Paul commented on this, is that this won't work if you're using things like Okta or you've got MFA enabled, primarily because if I go into my demo environment variables here, I'm actually putting in the username and password directly into the environment variables, and obviously it's not using a user interactive flow. What I'm working on right now is a new way of getting the user's access token by the default approach that Postman uses, which is the OAuth 2.0. And what this does is it means I have to go through and set up these variety of features, and this will pull me back a access token into its own environmental variable. And the reason we didn't use this is because it's not as straightforward to then share that across all these requests in an environment variable. You can switch in and out. And so I'm gonna work on this to basically be able to pull this through. And what you'll notice is that we can do device code flows and other flows as part of this as well, because this becomes a user interactive approach. So if you do have tenants where you want to do things where they have MFA supported or other aspects supported, you'll have to just wait a little bit more patiently for me to get this done. And again, please feel free to give feedback on the issues list. We have got telemetry on how these things are being used. In the headers, we're passing through an SDK version, much like our own SDKs. And so on the back end in our reports, we can actually see who's been using these collections. So a big thank you for those that have tried this already. And as I say, please make sure you give us feedback in the issues list on that particular GitHub collection. I will flick back to the teams list just to see if there's any quick questions before we close for the day. It doesn't look like it. Paul has got in big capital letters, do not use these requests on real environments. Yes, please use developer tenants. And so actually that's one nice little segue before we close out. For those that aren't familiar, there is a programs tab that's now on the top navigation as well, which takes you to the program to go sign up. This will give you a developer subscription that you can go and use to try out all these awesome things that we've showed today and we show in all the other community calls. It gives you access to 25 accounts that you can create and run. And since August of last year, essentially, as long as you keep using that environment and you access other things to do with the program, that tenant will continue to renew as part of the benefits of the Office Developer Program. So it's a great thing to go do. And there's a bunch of work that they're actually doing if you go into the dashboard itself to do things that are personalized to your experience. This is actually going to work because I've not signed up with this particular tenant user. So it's actually going to go through the sign up process. But there's some real great benefits. So if you haven't already signed up to the dev program, I would highly encourage it. So with that, thank you very much for joining the call. We will not see you on this call next month, but we will definitely see you in Build across all the different presentations we're doing. And we look forward to hearing all your feedback on the Microsoft Graph and excited to hear your stories. If you're interested in presenting, please reach out to us. We'd love to have external people presenting on what you've done on Microsoft Graph as well. So big thanks, and thank you, Daryl, for taking your time out of your conference time over in Amsterdam there to share all the SDK stuff too.
Not a problem.
Well, enjoy your day or evenings, and we'll see you in June.